Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I want to begin by congratulating my good friend, Chairman Klein, on getting this legislation to this point and hopefully soon onto the floor. I know how supportive you've been of this and how hard you've worked on it over the years, and very, very grateful for it. I suppose I approach this as a consistent advocate of tribal sovereignty. And as my friends on the other side of the aisle know, sometimes that puts me with them. And I think of the Violence Against Women Act. I was for it anyway, but the tribal sovereignty provision was decisive for me. And so I worked with Democratic friends to see that that was passed and placed on the president's desk, and he signed it. This is, and I recognize my good friend from Florida's dilemma here. It is difficult. It does put some competing principles. But for me, tribal sovereignty is always supreme in this matter. And so I'm delighted to work with my Republican and some of my Democratic friends to make sure that we expand tribal sovereignty yet again and really reclaim what was lost. Let me ask both of you this question. Does the NLRB have jurisdiction over any other government's employees?
Not that I know. The gentleman from Florida pointed out from the very beginning that it wouldn't apply to any state or political division thereof, but somehow that escaped the Indian tribes. And if I could, if the gentleman would bear with me for just a minute, my friend from Florida pointed out that we don't need this because the NLRB is deciding case by case where there's sovereignty. And I find that to be very, very troubling. I'll tell my friend from Florida, sovereignty isn't case by case, as determined by a bureau. Whether it's 5 members or 20 members, there is sovereignty or there is not. And so I think that underscores the problem, if I might say, to my friend from Florida. There should not be a case by case issue here. I'm sorry, you back.
Well, it is a case, it's law by law, because nobody's suggesting that the Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't apply. Nobody's saying that OSHA shouldn't apply. Nobody's saying that the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, shouldn't comply. Nobody's saying that Social Security Act shouldn't apply. Unemployment compensation being withheld. There are a lot of bills. Criminal law applies. You don't have sovereignty.
If I may, though, that wasn't my question.
I know.
Does the NLRB have jurisdiction over other government employees, state employees, county employees, municipal employees?
Post office, but in terms of states have within their laws, virtually all states, unfortunately Virginia is not one of them, but virtually all states have a provision for employees to be able to organize. And if the bill included an alternative mechanism, then we wouldn't be having the dispute we have now.
That's not my question. And my question is, does the NLRB have jurisdiction over any other governmental employees? And the answer is no, it doesn't.
Well, those employees have rights under other laws.
That's not my question. My question, and is there anything in the original legislation that created the NLRB where it had jurisdiction over Indian tribes?
Well, it had jurisdiction over everybody else, the Indian tribes.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have any jurisdiction over federal employees whatsoever. It doesn't have any jurisdiction over the employees of the state of Oklahoma or the state of Virginia or the state of Alabama or the state of New York or the state of California. It doesn't have any jurisdiction over county employees. I mean, does the original legislation that Congress wrote and passed give the NLRB jurisdiction in this area?
The problem with this is that when you say Indian lands, that does not mean on the reservation. That means Indian owned. So you can have a casino in downtown Las Vegas, happens to be owned by a tribe, and all of a sudden those people
we'll get to the kind of thing, but
today have rights to organize.
Not my question. My question again. Did the original legislation give the NLRB any jurisdiction over Indian tribes? And I think if you go back and check, it did not. Was there any other subsequent act of Congress that gave the NLRB jurisdiction over Indian tribes?
Well, there are a lot of laws that are silent that the laws apply. And if it was silent, the law can apply or not, depending on what the interpretation of the courts are.
Again, I don't mean to be belligerent, but I'm just asking,
Okay.
do you know, well, I can tell you, no. I mean, so the NLRB claimed this jurisdiction on its own in 2004. It didn't come and ask Congress. It wasn't given this title, and for decades it operated without the idea that it had jurisdiction here. It just decided on its own, bureaucratically, in 2004, that it would do this. And it did so, and in doing so, it developed an artificial distinction between tribal employees. It said it did not have jurisdiction over, quote, governmental functions, but it did have over commercial activities. We've got lots of states involved in commercial activities. State of Virginia runs the liquor stores. We have plenty of park services that run hotels, that do all sorts of things, but the NLRB still doesn't have jurisdiction in those areas. And so this is a case really of a bureaucracy taking jurisdiction, in my view, on its own. And without any act of Congress deciding its power would go. The other principal thing here that's important to recognize is that, you know, these are sovereign entities that don't have the power to tax. In other words, we've limited their sovereignty in that way. So this is their governmental income. And, you know, it should be up to them to run their own labor affairs. And this is, you know, significantly supports their governmental functions, their services to their own tribes. But bottom line is, again, there's just simply no congressional action that gives the NLRB this kind of authority. Never has been.
Well, the one problem is that most of the people that work in these operations are not members of the tribe. If it was just a on-the-reservation situation where the members of the reservation were working, you wouldn't have this problem. The problem is you're downtown Las Vegas, 75% or more of the people working there have nothing to do with the tribe. It's just a commercial
I
operation.
don't think there's any tribal facilities in downtown Las Vegas, but, you know, I get your point, but that's, you know, that's a free choice as to whether you work there. The NLRB doesn't have any jurisdiction if you work in the federal government either. That's my choice. I choose to work for the federal government, but the NLRB doesn't get to all of a sudden claim, you know, authority there. This is a governmental entity. These are governmental employees. And for the entire history of the board, until 2004, which is about 70-odd years, it never claimed that authority previously. So anyway, this seems to me a straightforward thing. You're either for tribal sovereignty or you're not. They either get to run their affairs or they don't. I thought it was appropriate for them to have jurisdiction on their own land, and the Violence Against Women Act. Somebody came on that was non-native and committed a crime on their territory, that their courts and their law enforcement should have jurisdiction. And that was the position of the administration too, by the way, and I thought it was the right thing to do. I think this is the right thing to do for exactly the same reason. The sad and long history of this has been the erosion of tribal sovereignty on their own lands over their own activities. And this is a case where a federal agency, without congressional authorization, decided on its own that it would just assume jurisdiction. Didn't go ask the Indian tribes if they wanted to have this jurisdiction. Didn't come ask Congress to have this authority, even though it wasn't. It just decided on its own it would assert authority. And I think this is an effort to correct that. And if Congress wanted to do something legislatively, I suppose they could. And then that would raise the question, do we want to extend the NLRB's jurisdiction over federal employees and state employees and local employees? But in this case, this is one where a federal bureaucracy on its own decided it would just take jurisdiction over something it had not had jurisdiction before, and Congress had not granted it. So I appreciate, Mr. Klein, your effort and Mr. Akita's effort. I know this is his bill. I know how hard he's worked on it. And interesting to note, he's not from a state that has any Indian tribes there, but I'm really proud. Yeah, in Indiana, that's another story about how we get to a state in America that there's no Indian tribes in a place called Indiana, but that takes us to a sad chapter of our history I won't go into here. But I do appreciate his efforts a great deal. And I appreciate your efforts and the efforts of your committee, and I appreciate the fact that it's bipartisan as well, because I know we have many Democratic friends. But I also want to join my friend in Florida, and I do recognize that this is difficult. You know, in some ways, those of us on this side of the aisle, violence against women, tribal positions, wasn't difficult for me. but it was for some of my colleagues. And I understood because they saw fundamental values in conflict in terms of constitutional guarantees and what I understand all that. But at the end of the day, if tribes are going to be sovereign, they need to be sovereign, to your point, Mr. Chairman, and this legislation clarifies that in a very important area. So I thank you for bringing it. Without, I yield back.